Alrighty, and it looks like people are filing in, so we're a minute or so after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get kicked off. So for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the ISA or IEC 62443 standard, specifically looking at part 2-1. And we've been doing quite a few assessments in this area, and I wanted to put together some common trends that we're seeing, some things that we've learned from those assessments, and some tips for organizations who are looking to, let's say, get an assessment like that done, things that they can do ahead of time, as well as just some general lessons and learnings from this area. And so really we're seeing this in everything we do, whether it's our safety work or our cyber work, but the cybersecurity aspect is really becoming a increasingly important aspect of daily life, or just what organizations are doing for those asset owners, or basically those companies that are responsible for operating or maintaining any industrial sites. And as more asset owners start to get into this area, questions like, well, what do I have to do to secure my site? Is what I'm doing good enough? What should I be looking to? We're getting more and more of those questions. And each of them by themselves might seem like a simple question of, well, what do I have to do? But as we start to dig in and understand how sites may be different, as we think about all of the different aspects that go into truly securing and having confidence that a site is well protected against cybersecurity threats, we'll see that there are a lot of nuances that we can get into. And we'll talk about how the 2-1 standard provides a really good starting point for understanding what is going to go into securing that site, and something that sites can use to really base their procedures and their approach off of. And so we'll talk about some of the challenges that we ran into, as well as some of the common corrective actions and strategies that we've seen. For this webinar, we are using the GoToWebinar application. So please make sure that you can hear me. If the slides are moving and you haven't heard anything yet, please make sure that your speaker is enabled in all places. There's also the questions tool to the right side of your screen. So you can use that at any point if you have audio issues throughout the presentation. Additionally, if you have any questions about the content from the webinar, please feel free to put those in the chat at any time. We should have around 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to spend answering those questions. And with that, I'll go ahead and just give a little bit of background on myself and on Exida. So my name is Patrick O'Brien. I am a cybersecurity team lead at Exida. So I run our site and system cybersecurity team. So we really focus on the 2-1 and 2-4 portion of the standard from a procedure aspect, as well as doing risk assessments against the 3-2 portion of ISA 62443, and the site security requirements that are in, or the system security requirements in 3-3. And so we do lots of different projects in that area, but that's one of my key roles. I also still work on our functional safety side, so I have a little bit of split time there. And my background is in chemical engineering. And so, with the 9 or so years I've been at Exida, for the first 3 to 4 years, I really was focused on that process safety side, working with Excellentia, doing lots of process hazard analysis and LOPA studies. And over time, we saw cyber becoming a more and more critical part of what sites were facing. And so really started to spend some significant time there as well. As part of that, I co-authored the Exida book on implementing the IEC 62443 standard, looking at a pragmatic approach to cybersecurity that really is focused on asset owners and understanding how they can take the different aspects of the standard and some other industry best practices and really apply that in a way that will work for them. We've also worked to develop a book with the Center for Chemical Process Safety on managing cybersecurity in the process industry and taking a risk-based approach and really handling cybersecurity the same way that process safety is approached to in these industrial sites. And then also, as part of my role, I sit on a number of ISA 99 committees, the ISA Global Cybersecurity Alliance, as well as some of the ISA secure aspects. So have some good exposure to what's happening in the standards committees as well. For exida, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we really work in three different areas with our customers, and we work with them to achieve safe, reliable, and secure solutions. So the first area where we were originally founded is our certification and assessment group. So we can provide functional safety certification to a number of standards from IEC 61508 for standalone components to IEC 61511 for installed systems, ISO 26262 for automotive applications, and IEC 62061 and ISO 13849 for machinery applications. And we are accredited both in the US as well as in Europe as a notified body out of our Irish office. And so we do lots of certifications in both areas. We also provide cybersecurity certifications and are accredited to our exida schemes as well as the ISA secure schemes. And we can do things like development lifecycle certification, component and system certifications, as well as certifications for maintenance and integration service providers. In our lifecycle services group, we provide services directly to asset owners in three main areas, looking at process and functional safety as one, as well as alarm management and cybersecurity. And so for this is where we'd be working directly with the site to say do a risk assessment for them or do a assessment against the 2-1 standard and really help them figure out what they need to implement for their cybersecurity program. And then lastly, for our enterprise tools, we have a series of tools that we've developed to support both our internal personnel as well as our customers, where they can purchase those tools and use them directly. We have the Excellentia suite for handling the full functional safety lifecycle, as well as alarm rationalization and cybersecurity risk assessment. And then we also have a series of OEMX tools for doing things like FMEAs, FMEDAs, and threat analysis type studies. And so for today's webinar, we'll really be focusing on the idea of IEC 62443 assessments, looking specifically at part 2-1, and you understand what are some of the typical findings or those lessons that we've learned from those real world assessments. And then lastly, a lot of times we get questions like, well, we know that this is a priority, but what can we do to get started? What can we do to try to get ahead of the curve, right? And a lot of sites have this feeling that they know cybersecurity is coming and becoming more and more important, but they don't necessarily know what they should start doing. And we'll talk about kind of the interplay between that and the gap assessments. But that is definitely a question that we get asked often. And so to start, it's helpful to have a good background and understand, well, when we talk about doing an assessment to IEC 62443 part 2-1, what does that really look like? And as some companies are starting to get acquainted with industrial cybersecurity standards, the first question is, well, when we look at IEC 62443, it's broken up into 15 different parts. And so there are a lot of different pieces to this. It is a series of standards or a standard series. It's not a framework because it does provide more specific guidance and requirements that can be assessed against. And a lot of companies may struggle to understand exactly what's applicable to them and what they need to focus on because there are many different parts. And so something that they've developed in some of the newer releases of the standard is more of a logical view of understanding what parts of the standard really apply to what stakeholder groups. And I think that is a much more helpful view to look at the standard. And so we'll call that the logical view. And so here it breaks up our companies that are involved in industrial cybersecurity into three different groups. There are product supplier groups who are the OEMs developing standalone products. They might be embedded devices like a controller, could be a network device like a firewall or a data diode, or it could even be a software application where they're developing custom software that's going to run on an engineering workstation or some type of server. But all of those components would fall under this product supplier umbrella, where they have to develop those products following their secure lifecycle. So 4-1 is their procedural aspect, and then meet security requirements against 4-2, which would be the security capabilities needed to achieve a different security level for that component. And so from there, then a configured instance of that product or that product combined with some other systems or subsystems is our automation solution. And the system integrator is now that next party who's responsible for pulling together those different products or those different pieces into a comprehensive system, or an automation solution is the term that the standard uses to describe that. And so 2-4 covers their integration and maintenance processes, and 3-2 covers their risk assessment to really understand what sort of risks and consequences there would be if that system is compromised. And then the controls and the requirements that they need to meet for that system is looked at based on the 3-3 standard. And then above that, the asset owner, so the person who's actually operating or is responsible for that site on an ongoing basis, 2-1 covers their specific procedural aspects, and then there are some ongoing parts of 2-4 that apply to operations as well. And so ultimately, when we talk about the industrial automation and control system, or IICS, it's this kind of comprehensive piece that includes not just the technical aspects, but also the capabilities, the policies and procedures, and the people that are working in that system. And so if we think about what an asset owner is directly involved in, the 2-1 standard may be the most important standard for them to focus on, but it's very important that we realize that they're not an island and that really they're relying on these other stakeholder groups in order to be successful. And if an operator is starting from something that was not designed properly, that was integrated poorly, that isn't meeting the specification, well, it may not matter how good their policies and procedures are. They still have to worry about everything else. So it's good to remember both, let's say the specific focus of the asset owners, but also realize what that involves from the other groups. And again, this term of industrial automation and control system, or IACS, is used frequently throughout the standard. And really, this is again, it's not just the technical aspects, it's not just the physical devices at the site, but it does involve really the people, the procedures, and the hardware and software as well. So everything that's installed on that system, the people interacting with it, and the procedures and guidelines that define how they interact with it. And as we look at the 2-1 standard, and look at this question of, well, what does it mean to have a security program that is really compliant with the standard, or this idea of, let's say, compliance versus meeting the intent? We have a lot of, let's say, good discussions with our customers on exactly what their goals are to understand what they're looking at. But if a company is looking at this series of standards and says, we want to have a security program that's comprehensive, we've adopted 62443 and we want to comply with it, it's important to understand what that actually means. And the standard breaks that up into kind of 3 different areas with a couple of different subparts. And we'll talk about really what parts of the standard or what standards each of those parts really relate to, if you wanted to understand what parts are involved in this. So first, they have to have organizational capabilities that include an ISMS, which is an information security management system. So essentially on the IT side, that has organization-wide policies and practices for IT systems. And so really what this is saying is 62443 is not meant to come in and replace existing IT standards, existing IT policies. It's understood for those information security systems, that there are already well-defined best practices that are in place and need to be followed. And really that ISMS is almost a prerequisite, where if you're not handling the enterprise or the IT side of things, you're not going to have the infrastructure likely that's needed to support the OT side. So that is a critical first step for organizations to have. From there, we then have to have coordination between the IACS and the IT infrastructure in its environment. And really, we can think about this part 2 as kind of, let's say, addressing what's become a very popular buzzword in terms of IT and OT convergence, of this idea that we really do need our IT and our OT or our group responsible for the IICS to be working together. And so understanding what aspects of those organization-wide policies can fit for ICS environments and what portions may have to be adjusted, and really having that procedural relationship between what the corporate does and what the site does is important. And that is something that we can look at as part of the site-specific policies and procedures that we would evaluate against 2-1. In part B, here we look at the technical security capabilities implemented in hardware and software components for that automation solution or that system that comprises the IICS. And we may have one or more automation solution within the IICS. And so really, when we talk about technical security capabilities, this is mentioning and going back to that IEC 62443 part 3-3 part of the standard. So really compliance, it's not just procedural, but we have to marry the procedural requirements with the specific technical capabilities. And then the last part, the security related processes used to securely deploy, configure, and operate the IICS, as well as to maintain its technical security capabilities. And really that is a combination of 2-1 considering the ongoing operations requirements of the asset owner, and part 2-4 considering what needs to be done by the maintenance and integration service providers. And so this gives us a pretty good starting view of really what parts of the standard, if we have a site and we want to say that it's going to comply with 62443, what would be involved. Now, one other part that we can add in is a slight wrinkle or slight addition to this is another important aspect is understanding what level of technical security requirements are needed. And that's really where the 3-2 standard comes into play, where a site has to do a risk assessment to understand what sort of technical requirements they need. So we can almost think about 3-2 being another aspect that comes in here. And something that ISA Secure is working on that we're starting to see a lot of interest in is the AEC SSA program or the AXA program, which is the Automation Control System Site Assessment, which is looking at if you actually wanted to go in and do either some sort of formal inspection or potentially a certification of a site to say, yes, this site is meeting the relevant aspects of ISA or IEC 62443, what would that look like? And so that actually looks at all of these parts of the standard for 2-1, 2-4, 3-3, as well as that 3-2 to make sure the risk assessment's done. So that gives an idea of really what's involved with the site looking to comply with the standard. And so if we take a little bit of a deeper dive at 2-1, and start with that as kind of the policy and procedures that the asset owner themselves needs to have in place. This is broken down into 8 security program elements, and thinking of these as kind of those fundamental atoms or building blocks of the program. So things like organizational security measures, how do they handle personnel security? What sort of background checks do they do? What sort of structure do they have? How do they interface with their IT systems? All the way through some things that are a little bit more technical, things like what sort of component security requirements are there? How are they protecting data? What sort of user access control requirements do they have? And so although some of these are more technical, this is still the, let's say, procedural aspects of it. So do they have policies and procedures defined that accurately describe what they do for component security? Do they have procedures that accurately describe how they address protection of data? And so that's what we would look at from a 2-1 is it written? And then the next step would be looking at, is it implemented? And when we take a site or an organization's security program and look at evaluating it, really we're evaluating it against what we call a maturity level, looking at how well documented are the procedures and how well practiced or followed are they. So maturity level 1 just means initial ad hoc. Essentially, every site that there is can claim that they are initial because they are, doing some security activities or they come up when needed. there's not really any evidence that's needed to get an ML1 attestation, because it basically says you don't have evidence. So typically where a target or an assessment would start would be looking for maturity level 2, which is to say, do they have all of the written policies and procedures that they need to adhere to the standard, and have they trained personnel so that they have the competency to follow it? So that's typically the first goal that companies would have. The next level of maturity is, once everything is written, well, then have you implemented it, have you practiced it, and can you show that you are actually following those steps consistently for your site? And then the highest level of maturity is ML4 or improving, where there are continuous improvement strategies based on having metrics for those different aspects of the procedures and really understanding what needs to be done to continually improve and grow that maturity over time. So when we talk about 2-1 or 2-4, anything that is a security program related standard or a procedure based standard for 62443, really we're talking about what maturity level is an organization reaching. But when we go to the technical security capability side, it then switches, and we're talking about a security level, which is a level from 1 to 4 that talks about how robust the capabilities are for that component or that system, and how well is that protected against different types of common attackers versus, say, a staff internal mistake on one end, all the way up to a nation state attack. And really, depending on the risks for that site, the target of what security level they need to meet may vary. Where if there's a less critical system, SL1 may be all that's required for it to implement a number of best practices and a really good starting robust requirements for cybersecurity. Whereas for other systems, if let's say they're critical safety systems or critical control systems, they may have significant risk associated with them and may need to, say, target security level 3 and have the additional requirements involved to meet that higher level. And so when we talk about technical security capabilities, these are typically measured by identifying what foundational requirements, system requirements and requirement enhancements are met from either 4-2 or 3-3. So it's more of a technical comparison of is this in place and is it adequate against that requirement. So we can see that there's kind of both the procedural and the technical aspect when we talk about how to assess a site. And so before we can kind of dig deeper into a lot of times what we see with our 2-1 assessments, we get questions about, well, what even does it mean to have an assessment? I put assessment in air quotes here because what one company calls an assessment may vary quite significantly from what another company calls an assessment. And so these are 4 different types of common assessments that we have done and have seen for operating plans. So the first one is a gap or readiness assessment or analysis, where basically we look to put together an understanding of that current cybersecurity position for an organization and a path for improvement. And a lot of times this is a good first step for companies who aren't necessarily sure exactly how mature they are and want a little bit of an outside view to help them put that plan together. But it tends to be a little bit more of a high-level assessment because we're focusing more on the gaps and the options for improvement, not necessarily rigorously checking each requirement within a standard. For a risk assessment, this is what's done to evaluate part 3-2 of the standard and really understanding where the big cybersecurity risks are for a site, what are the critical components, and then what sort of protections or countermeasures are required to secure those critical components. A vulnerability assessment or analysis is looking specifically for what weaknesses exist in the control system. Could be hardware, could be software, could be procedural, that would make it more vulnerable to attackers. And a lot of times this is done as a supporting activity with either a risk or a gap assessment, depending on where the site is in operations. And then lastly, a compliance assessment is more of a formal assessment or inspection of compliance against the defined cybersecurity standard. So if we think about a formal 2-1 assessment, that would be looking at each requirement within the standard and seeing whether or not the site has procedures to meet it, seeing whether or not they've actually implemented those procedures and what evidence they have to show they're following the standard. And part of the goal of that development of the ACSSA program is so that if companies are looking for that formal compliance assessment, that they can go to qualified vendors and make sure that they are getting the exact same type of compliance assessment, that there's consistency there, because that's valuable both for companies, let's say, providing insurance or regulatory agencies who are trying to understand how asset owners are doing, as well as for asset owners to be able to know that they're getting a consistent deliverable, or that they're being assessed against the same set of requirements and validation arguments. So that's something that's a potential very big benefit of that new program that's being developed. And so at exida, really we've done each of these different types of assessments depending on what customers are looking for. We'll kind of talk about why different types of assessments may fit better for certain companies depending on where they are in their cybersecurity journey. Another thing that's really important to understand is, well, what is the typical scope of an assessment? And I do have a kind of a caveat here on the bottom, is that depending on the type of assessment, the scope may vary significantly. And we'll look at 3 kind of common scopes we run into. But when it comes to a formal compliance assessment and something where you're ultimately looking to get some sort of certification or inspection report, really that is going to be defined to a single location with certain systems specifically identifying what hardware and software is on it, who are the maintenance and service providers. And so that's a really important part of any formal assessment, to really clearly define exactly what is included and considered. When we're talking about a gap assessment or a risk assessment, there may be more variation there depending on what you're trying to understand and get from that assessment. So do just like to distinguish that before we go into the different examples. So on the bigger end of the potential scopes of an assessment that we've conducted, it could be a combination of both corporate policy. So what is the corporate IT group requiring? What sort of general OT guidance is there? As well as evaluating how has that been implemented, or in some cases not implemented, at multiple sites. So the scope for that assessment might be both the corporate office of what do we say we do, as well as a sampling of sites to see how well does that line up with what the organization is doing. And that can be really helpful for getting an idea of how well implemented or rolled out are our security practices. We could see that the assessment is a single site with multiple systems clearly defined. And when we talk about a more formal compliance assessment, that would be, say, a typical scope for something like that. Or we could have a single remote site consisting of a standard architecture. As we see renewable energy and let's say more hydrogen systems coming into play, we're actually seeing a much more distributed grid or ecosystem of sites compared to the typical one location chemical plant or refinery. So we are seeing more interest in assessing those types of standard sites that may have standard operating procedures and saying, well, for that type of site, how secure is the system? How well are we operating it in general? So that would be, say, another use case that we've seen. So now that we have a better understanding of what parts may be involved in an assessment for compliance, what types of scopes can be looked at depending on what type of assessment we're doing, we can then dig into a little bit more of the specific lessons learned that we found from a number of exercises that exida has done. And so we'll do a mix of some specific case studies as well as a couple of general findings that we've had. So the first case study I want to look at is an assessment that we did for a power company in Europe. We looked at both their corporate procedures as well as multiple sites in different regions and different areas, different types of sites as well. And we did a 2-1 gap assessment to see how well were their procedures written and how well were they implemented. And so what we found was that the corporate procedures addressed or partially addressed the majority of IEC 62443 2-1 requirements. So they had something written about how they handled organizational security. They had something written about data security, about their network security, and they had those requirements documented, and were in pretty good shape there. They covered most of the standard, maybe just a couple of non-compliances or things to look at adding to the procedures. But when we got out to the individual sites and actually walked the plants, talked with the people who were operating the sites, we saw that the implementation of those procedures varied very widely, with some sites doing a pretty good job, and other sites having major gaps, and sometimes not even having heard of those corporate policies and procedures. And to the organization's credit, they were very open about this. That was part of the reason why they wanted to do the corporate policies as well as the multiple sites, because they said, well, we know we're perfect or nearly perfect on paper, right? We've written everything down, we've got the requirements, but we have no idea how well that's being implemented. And so they were looking really for that gap assessment to see what sort of disconnect is there between what's written and what's actually done. And so really, I can almost call this as kind of the continental divide, or basically that difference between what's written and what's done. And that's something that time and time again, we've seen is very different for many sites. And we've seen that in many different assessments that we've done. So although the corporate OT procedures identified many of those key security areas, that major divide in how they were being implemented at sites, a lot of the site personnel weren't aware of corporate procedures. Sites hadn't received any training or support on those corporate procedures, and so there wasn't really that rollout piece. And as a result of that, although a lot of great work had been done in the corporate group, it was not seen at the site. We had major things like poor asset inventories, not updated network architectures, potential external connections that weren't known, lots of equipment that was connected that wasn't known. So as we started to dig into it, we said, hey, there are some pretty key things that we can do up front, or simple steps that would make a big difference. And so sometimes it's important to start with the bare minimum requirements, and then from there look at assessing more formal compliance and things like that. And so one of the things that I talk about in a lot of webinars is what the cybersecurity roadmap may look like. And although every company's journey is a little bit different, the amount of time you spend in different steps may be different. A lot of times the overall process is pretty similar, where first you need to build competency, assess gaps, understand where you are, develop that formal security program or cybersecurity management system, have the roadmap of how you're going to implement things over time, roll it out to sites and track performance. And if we think about this journey or this roadmap, understanding where your organization is really helps with identifying the appropriate type of assessment. And so a lot of times when we talk about this assess gaps, what we're talking about is that initial gap assessment, or that high-level gap assessment, where we want to figure out where are you, what are the most important steps to improve, but it's not necessarily a formal compliance assessment where you're saying, do you comply with every line of the standard? Because for a site where they don't have a DMZ, or where they don't have any background checks, there might be some very basic things that they need to do right away to address potentially major cyber risks before they're ready for more of a formal compliance assessment. And so a lot of time that initial gap assessment helps with these earlier phases of trying to understand where you are and what needs to happen next. Whereas a more formal compliance assessment is very helpful for companies who have a higher level of maturity and have already done the implementation and know where they are and are really looking for that external attestation that yes, they do really comply with the standards the way they think they do, and getting that cold eye review to say yes, you comply, checking the evidence that they're actually following it. And so that's typically what would be more involved in a formal compliance assessment. And so if we think about the we're perfect on paper situation, really they had gotten here where they knew what procedures they needed, they had developed them, and for the most part were in a pretty good state here. but they had kind of fallen off in this roadmap of how to implement it in the sites and the rollout program, where the sites really didn't see what had been written. They really weren't sure of what those procedures were. And so there was a major disconnect there. And so kind of a lot of the mitigation plan was to think about how they could roll it out at the site, what specific things do they need to do for each site. And we've seen that at a lot of different assessments that we've done. And so kind of the lesson here is that the goals and outcomes really vary by the assessment type. We think about that initial gap assessment, like I said, we're looking at strengths and weaknesses. We want to have recommendations for improvement, and that's really our goal and our outcome is what can we do to make the site better. It's all about prioritization because we know sites have limited time and resources. So really figuring out what they need to focus on and address first is key. And it's very helpful for building a new program, or if you see that your program has significant gaps where you know where you are, you can make some significant improvements there. Whereas a formal compliance assessment is really looking at verifying that compliance against the defined standard requirements. It is a detailed evaluation of both the procedures and how those are actually being implemented at sites. This is more applicable and beneficial to mature OT cybersecurity programs. And really, this is what the basis or will form the basis for more formal inspection reports or certifications down the road. So it's important to understand the differences between these two. A second case study that I want to talk on is about another company where we had done a series of gap assessments, dozen or so different sites, different site types, different regions. And basically, there were some previous IT audits that had been conducted against the ISO 27001 standard. And so part of the way through the assessment, some questions came up and they were, well, wait a second, why are we doing an OT cyber assessment? You know, hasn't this already been covered by what the IT group is doing? And I'll say that I have this up here as kind of a single case study, but this specific scenario has happened on at least 3 or 4 projects that I've been directly involved in. So this is something that we see a lot, where with that idea of IT and OT convergence, understanding how the group should work together and what's covered by one area versus another area is not always clear. And really thinking about this idea of coverage, and it's not necessarily a clear definition where OT is blue and IT is red, and we have this nice clear line down the middle where we know what's on the IT side and we know what's on the OT side. There is overlap, and as we see this convergence, there becomes more overlap, and it's a little bit messy to know exactly what's on each side. But what we do know is really always the case is that there are significant differences between the operational constraints and the way things are implemented for IT and OT systems. And so although having a formal ISMS system is really a prerequisite to having a successful OT security program, it by itself doesn't mean that just because a company has a good ISMS that they're doing things well in the plant for and really having successful implementation for their OT security program. And we've seen a lot of companies may underestimate the work that they have to do on the OT side because they've gotten, say, an ISO 27001 assessment or a certification on their IT side that says, hey, we're doing pretty good here. We have our IT programs in place. But if those haven't been tailored with what's really needed from the OT procedure set, those haven't been implemented on the site floor, there's maybe a lot of work and some pretty significant gaps if they haven't looked at the OT environment yet. And that's really what we found in the gap assessments. And as we work with these companies and start to show them, what happened on the IT side versus what it's looking like on the OT side, that realization that there's actually quite a large piece that hadn't been covered can be pretty quickly established. And again, that's an important part of establishing buy-in. And so something that we know a lot of companies do struggle with getting that question, but things to think about as you look at your internal plans for developing procedures on both sides of the fence. And so from those case studies as well as others, we got some kind of findings and takeaways that I just wanted to share. So the first one is that we're seeing significant variance in the maturity of organizations for OT security. Some sites are very mature. When we first started doing these assessments, in larger numbers 6 or 7 years ago, most companies were relatively immature. Some companies were better than others, but it was definitely somewhat new to everyone as they really dug into this. We've seen that the speed at which companies have implemented this OT security program has varied quite differently. Some companies have taken mature IT programs and very quickly and effectively deployed them to OT where they have pretty high maturity. Other sites, may still have a mature IT program but are very immature for OT. And so really knowing where you are and understanding, are you just getting started with OT cybersecurity versus do you have a mature program in place that's been rolled out, is important for understanding where your organization is and what the important next steps for you are. And so when an asset owner says we need a gap assessment or we need a compliance assessment, that might mean very different things for different asset owners. Another thing kind of on this last one, so previous assessments against ISO 27001, previous studies on the IT side are important background, and really it's a key starting point. But a lot of companies we have seen have underestimated the work that will be involved to take that and really deploy that and have something that works on the OT side of the fence. And we see that time and time again, and we'll kind of talk about where that comes in with getting ahead of the curve. Also, the next one, the rollout to the sites is at least as important as defining the requirements and the security procedures. So it's one thing to be perfect on paper and write everything down. If you can't practically implement that at the sites that you have and work with them to make progress, you may have a significant delay in between identifying what's needed and actually getting it implemented for the site. And then on the procedure side, it's not enough to just have a procedure that says what you do. They are very closely tied with the 3-through security capability requirements. So it does require an understanding of what technical approach is going to be taken, understanding some of the site constraints, and having really that close relationship between procedurally what's done and the security capabilities of what's actually going to be implemented. And so if we take those lessons and think about getting ahead of the curve or ahead of these requirements that are coming, I've got 5 kind of tips for sites looking to get ready for any sort of 2-1 gap assessment. And I will say that cybersecurity is a ever-changing area. I think anyone who's worked in that comes to realize that pretty quickly. So think about these as strategies for getting and staying ahead of the curve. So the first one is competency. And if there aren't competent people within an organization to take and lead the program, it will not be successful. I don't know how many times I will have to say that, but I will keep saying it until organizations really start to invest in this and understand that they have to train their people. They need to focus on that OT specific knowledge so that they can effectively develop and roll out programs for industrial sites. So we've got to start with competency. Next, knowing where your organization is, doing internal pre-assessments, just taking a realistic look in the mirror and saying, well, what do we have and what do we need is very important. Leveraging tools and templates wherever possible, anything you can do to make your life easier, take advantage of it. It'll save a lot of time and really energy and wasted time in the long run. Make sure that adequate resources are assigned for support. This is another area kind of with the competency that many organizations struggle with, where they say, yes, we want to comply with the standard, or yes, cybersecurity is our number 1 or our number 2 priority behind safety. And then you look at what's actually being dedicated to focus on it from the OT side. You say, well, wait a second, you can say that securing your plants is your number 1 priority, but if you don't assign any budget resources to it, if you don't have people who are dedicated internally to work on it, you're not going to make progress. And then the last one, proactively plan for site rollout and implementation. So on the competency side, really understanding who is going to be the lead for the security program, understanding who is going to be the site security lead for each of your individual sites, and making sure that they get OT-specific cybersecurity training that covers the life cycle, covers the key requirements that they need to meet. Absolutely critical. There are a couple of different certificate programs out there. I know IEC has one. Exida, we have a 4-day training course that comes with the certificate exam. There are also certification programs that actually look at, not only have you been through training courses, but more so, what sort of experience do you have? What sort of, credentials can you get, and really then test at a little bit of a higher level. But for those people leading the programs, those types of certificate and certification programs are really critical to develop that competency and even build their confidence in themselves to take and lead these activities. Not only is this a requirement in the IEC 62443 standards, but it really is just a prerequisite to getting things done. Additionally, awareness training for really all involved personnel, just to get them aware of differences between the IT and the OT aspects, seeing what they can take over and apply, as well as what requirements are different, is really important. And as you build that competency, you build that understanding of what needs to be done. We've seen tremendous correlations between that and buy-in and confidence in these types of initiatives. For the next one, understanding where your organization is currently. And what I have on this slide is just a partial excerpt from the 2-1 FDIS copy from 2023. I believe in the next few weeks we will get an official updated release. So we are looking at the new version of 2-1 here. And basically, if you want to look at a compliance assessment, and in the standard it defines what would be looked at for that. And the type of evidence that required. This is only about half of the list. So there's a full another table of this side of all of the things that a company that would want to do a compliance assessment and say, yes, we do comply with the standard, everything that they would need to have. And we see a lot of companies who want to jump in and say, oh, we're very mature, we're ready to go. And I would say, do a check. Do you have the evidence that you really need to do that type of formal assessment? Or would you be better off starting with a preliminary gap, figure out where your soft spots are, where are your flat points where you need to focus a little bit more, and really have that understanding of what has to get done first. Because by prioritizing and setting realistic goals, you'll be much more successful in the long run. For this next one, leverage tools and templates wherever possible. Make sure that you can take advantage of any starting points for whether it's risk assessment or policies and procedures. And templates and tools can help increase the speed of developing things. They can help make sure that you are aligning with the standards and best practices. And so just for example, when we work with organizations, we have a series of templates that we've developed for the 2-1 and 2-4 portions of the standard. And so if you're a company who is, maybe has some things on the IT side, but hasn't developed any OT procedures and you don't know where to start, you can actually purchase those templates and use them yourself just to get things going and really increase that speed. And we've seen that be very helpful to a lot of organizations when they try to develop programs like this. So certainly if there are tools or templates that make your life easier, definitely take advantage of those. The other one, assigning adequate resources. I will say outside of, well, what do I need to do? The second question we get is, well, how long does it take to be compliant for an asset owner? And in typical consultant fashion, the answer is it depends, but it depends on a lot of things. Where are you starting from? How many people are supporting the effort? How much of their time is dedicated to it? Do they have training and support to do what needs to be done? Are there barriers that are going to slow down implementation? So really, all of these questions can be explained by, well, how many resources are you putting on it? And realizing that there is, kind of a minimum just practical time for these things to get done. but also understanding that the difference between having a robust program in 1 year versus 3 years is, do you have dedicated people on the side of the site working on it? Do they have support to do what they need to do? And really, do they have a roadmap that they're following? And so we've seen that the answers to that question of, do you have the resources dedicated to it or not, is really the number one factor for determining how long this takes for companies to really make that improvement. And I cannot stress that one enough, because that is, again, another one of those big disconnects between, yes, this is one of our most important priorities, and yes, but we're also not really dedicating anyone to work on it full time, or yes, we have someone working on it, but they have 1 to 2 hours a week that they can spend on it. And it's just not really enough time to make significant progress if it's the third or fourth thing on someone's job duties. And kind of along with that last point of proactively plan for site rollout and implementation, get site personnel involved early in the process. Make sure that they're consulted and included on developing those cyber procedures. If there are changes that are coming out, make sure they have advance notice and there is a rollout period. Understand what specific challenges the site has. You're going to have to work with them around their operational constraints and other limitations, and really figure out what you can do to make it easy for them to implement the requirements, work with them so that they have a roadmap and know what they need to do. And another thing that we've seen time and time again is companies kind of setting up all of the bowling pins where they've got, okay, these are our procedures, this is our implementation plan, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and not involving the site with it, so that when they go to the site and look to implement this, that it absolutely falls apart, and all gets knocked over at the same time, whether it's the site can't make that implementation yet, if they have operational delays until the next outage, whatever it is, it really coordinating with the site early is majorly important for that implementation, that rollout. And so I just want to end by saying that we kind of focus a lot today about the gaps we see, and really that it does take work to go through and really make progress against the standards. And so we don't want to undersell that effort, but it is also important to realize that there are many benefits that organizations around the world are seeing that really outweigh the cost or the implementation time for 62443. There's clear defined definitions of stakeholder roles, matching security controls to the level of risk, looking at what capabilities need to be in place, applying it against multiple different site types, multiple industries, multiple regions, and really using that to help you meet different regulatory requirements and have confidence in the actions taken. We see a lot of benefits there. And so we have, sorry, I went on a little bit longer than planned, so just about 5 minutes for questions, but I do want to just mention that we do have online training courses that are available for the team to go through, and anyone who wants to get started on online self-paced, those can be taken at your own time. We also have a number of upcoming open enrollment courses that are live instructor-led. So definitely, if you want to learn more or you think about that first step of developing competency, those are a really great place to start. Also, if you enjoyed the webinar and want to see more information on this, please don't hesitate to follow Exida on social media, as well as, please don't hesitate to send me any emails for any questions we don't have a chance to get through today. My email is up there on the screen. And also, don't hesitate to reach out and connect on LinkedIn. Always happy to keep the discussion going there. So with that, I'm going to jump in and just take a quick look at the questions here. Okay. All right. So the first one here about copies of the slides. So we are not sending out copies of our webinars, the full slides anymore to attendees. But if you do have a specific question or a specific area that you're interested in, please don't hesitate to send me a message or a question on that, and we may be able to take a look at that. Okay, the second question here Will there be a matching or essentially a mapping of 62443 to the foundational requirements of OG86? And then for those of you who aren't familiar, OG86 is the operational guidelines from the HEC in the UK that a lot of critical infrastructure sites are being held to there. So for that one, I don't know if there will be any sort of formal ISA document that shows a mapping of 62443 to OG86. One thing that we at exida have done is actually done a combined gap assessment looking at 62443 and the key areas of OG86, where we do have a bit of that overlay of mapping of common requirements between them, as well as unique requirements to 62443 versus OG86. So we have done a number of gap assessments and cybersecurity risk assessments for companies that fall under that. And if you are interested in learning more, we could definitely talk about essentially what we do there and how we've used the standard to really help companies get a jump start on OG86, because there is quite a lot of overlap there where using 62443 as a baseline can really help with compliance to OG86. And I think that's kind of true for OG86 in the UK. And we've also seen that as pretty generally applicable, whether it's looking at the TSA security directive in the US for pipelines, or looking at SOC in Australia, to all of the different regulatory requirements that are really popping up around the globe. Okay, so yeah, so then the next question we have here is, we have someone who's an informatic engineer, so looking at trying to understand, if I don't know personally how to exploit a vulnerability for the plant, how can I make sure it's protected, right? So if I don't know how hackers are going to move through the plant, I don't know how they're going to exploit a certain vulnerability, how do I know, whether or not I protect against it? So what I would say there is kind of starting with the competency aspects of taking some foundational training to understand, let's say, the threat environment of what types of attacks are out there and what common things are taken advantage of. There's a lot that you can learn on the defensive side without needing all of the same technical details that the attackers have. And just a quick example there, two of the most common ways that attackers are still getting to industrial control systems are exposed endpoints that are internet connected and that can find basically doing IP scans and searches, and compromised credentials and getting over from the IT to the OT side. So, without having the technical skills to do that, if you can run simple scans on your site to identify, are there any exposed endpoints, if you can implement controls to help reduce phishing effectiveness for your site, you can make major progress of securing those vulnerabilities without having the same level of understanding as those attackers. So definitely I would recommend going through some training. Our CS100 course, just as an example, covers that in really good detail. And that can be a great first step in making some of those improvements to protect a site. Okay, so the next question here is, will we be running this session again? There may be some other colleagues who would benefit from joining. So for that one, we will be running it again today at 4 p.m. Eastern time, or we also will record it and upload it to YouTube as an asynchronous version. So if there's someone who can't attend today, we can definitely share that link and they can sit in and listen to the recording of the webinar. Alrighty, so that is the top of the hour. So we will go ahead and wrap up the recording here. But if there are any questions I didn't get a chance to answer live in the session, I will definitely reach out to follow up with you on that. So thank you everyone very much for your time. And we'll look forward to talking to you on another webinar soon.